This is Phantom Electric Ghost, and we're live on the air for the first time with Joe Sitnick. Thank you. You're an author, speaker, and advocate. And thank you for being on the Phantom Electric Ghost podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Want to let people know we are a featured podcast on the Newsly platform. You can see that icon up there. It says listen on Newsly. And if you see scrolling below, it says use coupon code GHOST. If you use that coupon code, you get 1 month free premium subscription. That's an audio only platform, but we're a featured podcast. So later tonight, we'll be on there and you can listen there, as well as on multiple platforms. On every major platform the podcast can be heard. Today, we're actually at episode 978 of the Phantom Electric Ghost podcast. We've been on the air tracking that on Apple Podcasts since 2016. And this episode, we also have your YouTube link for the Journey Sage, and that will be fully clickable. So you don't have to worry about trying to write that down. But when we are fully published on all the platforms, YouTube, Twitch, Facebook, you'll be able to click through on that. So if somebody clicks on that, that's your YouTube channel?
Yes, that's the channel that I'm creating that I wish had been around when I was going through psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy.
That's cool. So at least we let people know that we want people to do the detailed follow-up, and everything we talk about tonight, they'll be able to check your channel out. And then today, the focus is we're going to talk about healing PTSD with psychedelic MDMA. And so that's kind of the focal point. And maybe you want to give a little brief background in your from your experience and let the audience know, how we want to start with how you got into this.
Yeah,
process.
Who I am, why the heck I'm talking about this, right? Phantom, thank you so much for having me on the show. My name is Jill Sitnick. I run the Journey Sage YouTube channel primarily to help people understand what the process of healing PTSD with psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is, what it's like, what it is, what it isn't. In my late 40s, I was diagnosed with childhood trauma-induced PTSD. I had lost my partner of over 20 years. I was dealing with a whole bunch of grief, and about 18 months after his passing, I had this just never-ending sense of panic, sense of fear. The world was pretty much going to cave in around me. And I went back to my therapist who had helped me with my grief work, and we dove into a lot of my symptoms, the overriding fear, my body tensing up. I was in fight or flight for months for no reason whatsoever. And as she dug a little bit more into my background, what I thought was just kind of a bad, unpleasant background, what I've learned is that my body held an awful lot of trauma from that experience. My therapist at the time was working towards being a psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy practitioner. I was very, very lucky that she was able to point me to all of the research at maps.org about this particular healing modality. And very long story short, after a full year and 3 psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy journeys with my therapist and my guide, I no longer qualified for a PTSD diagnosis. So that's kind of me in a nutshell, and I'm ready to answer any and all questions.
That's very interesting because I never looked into this perspective. I've heard about it. I've actually had some people kind of talking about it, never directly. And this is the first interview I've had with somebody who's actually going to speak to what this type of therapy entails and what it is about. So maybe you can kind of give like an example of the PTSD, because some people might not understand that, and then we can go deeper into the MDMA.
Absolutely. So I was an extremely high functioning adult. I worked in big tech. The bills were getting paid, the pets were getting fed, everything was fine. And I wound up having silly, I had a work email about needing to do something for work, and it just spiraled me. And I had every irrational thought that the joke I made at the time was that I was going to be stuck living in my car with my pets, that I was going to lose my job. I was never going to be able to get another job. Something was going to happen financially and I was going to lose my house. I mean, I was running mentally in my head against some sort of massive fear that made no sense. And I think one of the
Hmm.
best ways to describe PTSD, at least for people with child abuse, is that mentally, I knew what those thoughts were. They were ridiculous. But physically, my stomach was upset. I always do this. My shoulders were up here. I wasn't sleeping well. I wasn't eating well. And this went on for months. And I just didn't understand why. And that's pretty
Hmm.
much in a high functioning adult what PTSD looks like, feels like. And to be candid, I went to back to my therapist because I don't like to admit this, but I was seriously considering whether it was worth kind of even being in this existence and still remaining to live
Hmm.
because I didn't see a future in front of me.
Did you have trouble with like primary care doctors not knowing how to deal with that, and you immediately had to go to like a different, like to a therapist, to actually address it? Because I'm wondering if like if you have a family doctor or a primary doctor, do they immediately send you to a therapist, or do you have to find a therapist on your own?
In my instance, I'm hesitant to use the word lucky because none of this was lucky, but I had actually found my therapist to help me with my grief work. You know, friends are
Hmm.
fantastic to help you when you lose a partner or a spouse or a child or someone super, super close to you. But after a while, I needed a professional to kind of guide me through all of these emotions. So I was very lucky. To be candid, this therapy is in just completed phase 3 clinical trials. So I feel like most primary care physicians, number one, aren't going to know about this therapy. And number two, if you do mention the PTSD symptoms, I would hope they would encourage you to go to a therapist. That would be my hope. I can't speak to what they would do.
Yeah. Yeah, you don't know. Yeah, luckily you were, like you said, you wasn't lucky, but you were going through your trauma, and you had already had the therapist, and they were, of the mindset that, like, why not try something different? Why not try an alternative therapy? Because sometimes, some people, like, you get, people that don't want to try, CBD, and they have like certain like restrictions. Some doctors are like, no, we don't do that. They'll put you on a pharmaceutical. They would put you on something else. They won't try alternative medicine, or they won't try holistic medicine, or they won't try something that's like, cutting edge, or something that's different, or in trials. So then I think this is where I talked to somebody before on the podcast, that you kind of have to own your healthcare. That in terms of, you need to do some like research on your own. My father was this classic case where he expected a doctor to tell him everything, and he wouldn't tell the doctor anything. Right? He wouldn't tell him how he was feeling. He wouldn't say what was going on. He felt the doctor should just magically figure out from the blood test what's going on without telling the doctor about anything. And my mom would go crazy because she's like, "You're not telling him anything." He's like, "What's the point in telling me if you don't tell the doctor?"
In our healthcare, I know this from my partner's passing and illness. I agree with you 1,000%. I mean, if I could have had sparklers going when you said that, we have to own our healthcare. We have to repeat ourselves constantly. We have to take fantastic notes. We have to double check and research the responses we get. And I'll even add on with some doctors, and this is my experience, I had to actually say, I need to know the actual truth without you putting any flowery language on it. Tell me exactly what's happening. Treat me like a colleague,
Hmm.
because sometimes there's sense of family. And I did that with my therapist and my guide the entire way because I was new to psychedelics and I had all
Hmm.
of the stigma and all the fear. So yes,
Yeah.
own your healthcare.
Yeah. Cause there's
Yes.
always like, everybody thinks about psychedelics, they think about the Beatles, and they think about the hippie kind of culture, and they're like, and they might have a predisposed label for that, saying, well, that's hippie stuff. That's hippie nonsense. I don't want anything to do with that. Right. And they might be very conservative and they're like, they don't want anything to do with it without looking into whether or not it actually has therapeutic value. And, I was like, when I was 27, I was diagnosed with a level 3 sarcoma, and I had to research all kinds of things. And there was a trial they wanted me to go into, but the problem with the trial, since I had a level 3 sarcoma, it wasn't level 1. There was like a 50-50 shot that I was going to get a placebo, and I'm like, I can't really risk taking a placebo instead of something that's really going to do it, because it's a level
Yeah.
3 and it could go to a level. It was at the point of metastasizing, and I'm like, I needed something that was going to be more dynamic and direct, actually trying to get rid of it. And it's the matter
Absolutely.
of, like, when I was 27, I had to do the research to figure out and get multiple opinions and multiple doctors. I didn't go with the first doctor because they wanted to put me in this trial, and I'm like, but you're telling me there's a 50-50 shot. I'm not even going to get anything that's actually going to solve it. So I'm like, well, what's the
Yeah.
point of that?
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
mean,
I
so
don't blame you
sometimes you
one
really
bit.
have to look into something. Yeah, I mean, you look into this, you might like the labels. So how did you get like past that? Were you already kind of less intimidated by the idea of psychedelics, or did you have to kind of warm up to it yourself?
I had to warm up. That's a great question. I'm a child of the '80s, and I remember the "Just Say No" commercials with the egg in the
Yeah,
frying pan.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you're like, oh, I don't know if I should do that.
So there were two major factors that can actually, I should say there were three. I was an English teacher way back in the day, so math I get challenged on. There were three factors. Number one was my absolute frustration with the fact that I couldn't get over this panic. I could mentally figure it out. I couldn't control my
Mhm,
body. I had read The Body Keeps the Score. I started to understand trauma, and I started to understand that there was some deep trauma, and I always do this because of this, that it I had
mhm,
a problem. So number one, I had a problem. Number two, I trusted my therapist. She had a track record with me. I knew that in no way, shape, or form would she put me in any sort of harm. So that was super, super important. I'm a type A
mhm.
person, and if I felt in any way uncomfortable, I wouldn't have been good for me. And then third, she sent me right on over to maps.org. That's the organization that is running the clinic, or has run, I guess at this point I should say past tense, has run the clinical trials, and actually has the evidence that, like, and I'm summarizing, everybody can go online to look at their
Yeah,
website,
yeah.
that on average, two-thirds of the people who participate in the trials are similar like me. They no longer have a PTSD diagnosis. They no longer show
Hmm,
those symptoms. So clinical research, someone I trusted, and my very own frustration that
yeah.
I just didn't want to keep living this way.
Yeah, that's always good to have that trust relationship, because that's really good when I think when people are going toward therapists and coaches and mentors and shamans and all kinds of people, because sometimes maybe with like traditional medicine, they feel like, well, am I just a number because they're getting overwhelmed? Are they really an expert at this particular niche? Because a lot of times what happens is you have a very specific issue. You have to go to a specialist. You have to go to something that's kind
Uh,
of holistic or different, or therapy, which is different than primary care. And it's like,
well,
they wouldn't know about that. They don't know the details. They're not an expert, right? So then it becomes like a specialist and a therapist, like you had a trusted relationship. And I think that's really important when people are dealing with people. You have to have that trusted, like relationship to even go forward.
Well, and with psychedelics, you're in a kind way of saying it is an altered state or an enhanced state. And knowing with whom you are working, and knowing that those people, and there should be two, in my kind of therapy, there should be two, that those people are not going to do anything remotely harmful is incredibly, incredibly important.
Mhm. Yeah. So I would think so you have to have that kind of connection to the people that you're working with, because you can't be kind of out there, in the wilderness of like, oh, I don't know this. Like if you don't really know and you don't have the trust and you didn't do the research and you don't have the background to know, is that going to be harmful? Could you put your hands in with this person? Can you trust them enough to lead you where you want to go? Because you want to get better. And I think that's where you were hitting a wall. Like you said, there's like
Yeah.
the fight or flight thing that's happening because the saber tooth tiger or the bear is now like our daily life, and it's triggering us
Absolutely.
like we were running from the wolf, you know, and we
Yeah.
don't like
Yeah.
people are like, well, I can understand the wolf, but then I was like, how do you understand the modern life, the day to day things that actually trigger you like the wolf was chasing you in the woods?
An email. Right. Well, and let me
Yeah,
be super,
yeah.
super clear because lots of people work with shamans. They go to another country or they go out into the woods and they have phenomenal experiences. I stay very much in my lane in that
Hmm.
if someone like me, I had pretty severe childhood trauma, PTSD, and um, I'm sorry, my computer just kind of said we're going to go to sleep. There we go. Okay, so I had
Well, you
pretty
don't want that.
severe, yeah, I did. That you want to work, I would recommend you work with professionals who are skilled in dealing with trauma and PTSD. If you just have to kind of get out some of the cobwebs or something like that, your shamans are great. People with full-fledged diagnosis of PTSD, I strongly encourage working with professionals. So I hope that clarifies a little bit.
Yeah. That makes sense, because you have to know, like, first thing is to know what you have. Like, once you knew you had PTSD and you knew the severity of it, and if it was, if dealing with a therapist without the MDMA, if that wasn't working, then you had to get to the next level. Every time you never know. You have to determine what level of severity you're into at any condition. It's just like, in anything, like at level 3 sarcoma or level 4 or level 1 or level 0, like once you know where you are, then you can be informed of like what is appropriate for me to be looking at. And I think that's where people have to kind of not be like my dad and like actually ask questions and do some research,
Yes.
to figure it out.
Yes. Yes, because here you don't want to be in a situation where you're like me and you're at the end of your rope and you maybe have a negative experience because so set and setting with psychedelics so important. Your mindset going in, what your intentions are, the setting, where you are you physically comfortable? Are you with people that you trust? Those are pretty much the two elements that
Mhm.
whenever you're reading any article about psychedelics, they talk about those important elements. And with deep trauma people, I got to tell you, those two elements, super, super important in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense that you have to be in an appropriate setting where they have like
Yeah.
the safety net to make sure that you're not going to anything can't go wrong. Um, because you just want to have that capability to handle it. Like you don't always want to be pessimistic, but you have to be smart about what can happen. So I think the idea of using this though, maybe you can talk about like the I don't know, the properties and the difference between the different types of therapies, because I think there's like the idea of magic
Mhm.
mushrooms and then there's
Yep.
MDMA. Maybe you can talk about the differences and like what levels are require either one.
This is like my favorite topic ever because I love dispelling all the stigmas around psychedelics. Okay, so MDMA is a synthetic psychedelic, early 1900s. Go read Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind. He does a great summary of all that stuff. I could never do any of that justice. MDMA, the street name is ecstasy or Molly. So it's been around for, ever. And MDMA, some people argue, not me, some people argue that it isn't even a classic psychedelic because it doesn't produce any of the visuals. So I go into my journey space with my doctors. We talk about my intentions. I take my MDMA tablet, or I'm sorry, capsule. And within an hour, hour and a half, I start being able to talk about my absolute fear of my father. I am just adamant with my doctors that if my father was right here, he would try to hurt me, that his entire goal was to ruin my life. And here's the important thing: with the MDMA in my system, my shoulders weren't up, my stomach wasn't upset, I wasn't shaking with fear. And if I had had those kind of conversations without that psychedelic in my system, I would have felt those physical symptoms. And so, what
Mm.
MDMA did during the actual therapeutic journey, and for me, weeks to 2 or 3 months on average, it made it so that when I thought about my childhood, when I talked about my father beating me, when I talked about my mother's suicides, when I talked about, you know, getting kicked out of my house, being homeless a little bit when I was a child, you know, I was able to have those memories float without my body responding. So that's
Oh,
MDMA. It's extremely, I almost want to use the word boring, because it's not your brain, it's not your egg in the frying
yeah.
pan experience in any way, shape, or form. Now, magic mushrooms, or the chemical psilocybin that actually turns into another chemical in your system. In my third journey, my doctors and I had talked an awful lot about, there was a block. I was still really, really scared. I mean, we had gone through 2 journeys, had done a ton of work, and I still had this massive fear. And it was very, very clear to them that I had a pretty huge block. And so we discussed, let's work with the MDMA because we're making a lot of progress. And if during the journey we get to a point where there's this block, let's consider working with a little bit of psilocybin. And that's ultimately what happened. I had my regular dose of MDMA, and whatever that was. I don't talk about dosage. And then I would say about
Hmm.
3 hours into the journey, I hit that block. My doctors gave me a very low dose of psilocybin. And that's when I started to see some visuals. And I had an amazing visualization of my childhood home just opening up and me being freed from my childhood home. And that's where the visuals came in with that particular chemical. Yeah. Um, so I would say
When you're
magic
being
mushrooms, psilocybin.
prompted by your, yeah. I guess the
No,
question is like during these journeys, is your therapist like prompting, or is just the medications themselves allow that without like prompting from the therapist to get you to a certain point in your mind?
you know what? I immediately said no, but let me take that back. The goal of a guide is to mirror the patient. So whatever the patient is bringing up, the guide's role is to help the patient investigate that. My guides and therapists, the more they knew me, the more they challenged some of the limiting beliefs. Um, and
Mhm.
because I have all the transcripts. And by the way, if you're doing this therapeutically, absolutely record it, on your phone, voice memo, whatever, so you can go back and listen. So I
Yeah.
wouldn't say that there was like prompting, like, well, how do you feel about that? I would say there was more guiding when I, as a patient, kind of hit a little bit of a wall.
Oh, so like hit limiting beliefs, and then they would kind of push on that to try to expose it and maybe hope that you could
Yeah.
break through the door, Jordan Morrison was always talking about like break on through. It's just kind of poetically as
Yes.
a great poet, he was kind of exploring that within the doors, and it was, oh, what's
Yeah.
that about? Well, he is a poet, so he was talking
Yep.
about a lot of that in a metaphorical sense. But it's
Right.
interesting that
Right.
that can be reality. The idea that you can break through these barriers that you might have built up or these
Yeah.
limiting beliefs and these ceilings. And I think that's what a lot of people find, when they go to therapists, they go to shamans, they go to mentors because they kind of hit this wall and then they can't do it by themselves. So they have to find some assistance to solve, like, get the self actualized and get past the problem, actually be, your authentic self and not have all these things like stopping you because, oh, I'm not good enough, or my father did this, or my mom did that, my grandma did this. It's like, but what what are you doing
Yes.
to yourself too? Because what are you thinking that you can't do something? A lot of us, I find a lot that can't. Like, what I can't do this, I can't do that. You know, that is a lot of that. It's not because somebody else. It's kind of like how you interpreted, and then it put this barrier. And then it's interesting that these substances that help you
Yeah.
get past that, where maybe you couldn't, like were physically feeling effects that you couldn't move forward because you kept on having the physical aspects kind of preventing you, right? Is that what it was kind of boiling down to, right?
My body was at in my late 40s. I don't give my actual age, right? In my late 40s, my body was reacting as it reacted when I was below the most of the time below the age of 5 and the fear I was experiencing as a toddler. That's how my body was responding in my late 40s.
Mm,
Absolutely.
wow. So
Yeah.
yeah, so that's definitely something that's like a big block. It seems
Yeah.
like the only thing that worked for you is this MDMA therapy. Because like yeah, everybody's different, in terms of like what they need to get past where they are. And it's just interesting you discovered where you were, and then you had the appropriate therapist to help you explore this. And so it's like
Yeah.
it just seems really interesting, that this is something that I think a lot of times we could, if you get back to the beginning of there's a lot of people that probably would never try this because of they've got the labels of
Scary.
the labels
Yeah.
are, yeah, and so the labels will stop them from doing some, uh, and maybe they really need it, but the
Right.
label of like, oh, they grew up with like Nancy Reagan saying this, so like they're not going to do it because they're kind of stuck to that. They're like, I'm going to be that way. That's what I am doing. He's like, and that's fine because that's what you want. You can't tell people what to do, but at some point, like if they really need it, it might be more difficult for people in that space because like they have the socialization that
Right.
been telling them they can't do it.
Well, to be honest, Phantom, that's why we're talking right now. At the end of my third journey, I knew work had been done. I still had integration. I still had 2 or 3 months to kind of process everything. But I came out of that journey knowing because I could remember my childhood house splitting apart. And I was like, I know I did some great work. And there was a part of me that just said, I need to tell people that this is a viable therapy because there are so many stigmas. I mean, when I told my friends that I was going to be taking psychedelics to help my mental health, trust me, I got some pushback. And so I could just imagine, people have to kind of talk to me a little bit and I start to explain what this is and what it's about. And they're like, oh, that's really interesting. But their initial response is, oh, psychedelics, scary. And so I got to be honest, I thought I was so incredibly lucky. I mean, it probably goes way beyond luck to have access to my amazing therapist who offered this healing modality. And I thought I would just be doing such a disservice if I didn't try to explain what it is to take the fear away. Because FDA approval for this, for MDMA for PTSD therapy, is slated for 2024. It's coming up. And I just wanted to be a voice to support that as opposed to maybe the media starting to do clickbait, fear mongering, what happened in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
60s, that kind of stuff. So that's why we're talking.
Well, that's real important. Being a cancer survivor, there's a whole thing about using cannabis, and because it
Mhm.
helps you when you're undergoing chemo. And it's like you can't eat,
Right.
and there's some people back when those things, that was a big deal too. That people are like, oh, you can't, oh, you
Mhm.
shouldn't do that because again, it's
Shouldn't
like,
do
oh,
it.
the war on drugs. It's like, well, I'm into cancer. It's like I need to eat. This actually helps you eat.
Right.
If you're undergoing.
And
So like you can have your moral judgment, but I'm in the middle of this and I need what's gonna work, and that's scientific, and it's like it's real. So, but the
yes.
problem is like
Yes.
culturally, people get so tied to their
Yeah.
mores. I was a sociology major, and they're like, people are so tied to some things that sometimes like, well, why are you tied to that? Like, well, somebody told me, my grandpa told me, my priest told me, my whatever, somebody told me. And then you do,
Right.
there's like, well, did
Right.
you actually even check it out? There's like, they just totally believe it without even challenging it. And I think
Right.
as a critical thinking, you're not going to put down faith. You're like, fine. But the thing is that sometimes in your life, there's something that you might need, and you have to critically
Hmm.
think, like, okay, this is what I was told. This is where I
Hmm.
am. This is what this offers. Am I going to still, I'm going to stay in this box and I can't go back out of that box? It's like, whoa, that's up to you.
Right. 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 I mean, honestly, if I hadn't seen the clinical trial data, I'm not 1,000% sure I would have done it. I was
Yeah,
pretty desperate. I was borderline suicidal, but looking at the data and seeing that it was there, um, definitely helped me make my decision, which points right back to what you just said. Look at the evidence, the science-based evidence, the clinical research, and then go ahead and make a decision versus you saw some really slick media in the 80s of an egg in a frying pan. You know,
yeah, yeah.
what do you really
Well,
want
you
to
also
base your
like,
decision on?
yeah, because I mean, a lot of times people, they're kind of stuck in a paradigm, and it's not actually good for them. Like how many
Yeah.
women have been stuck in really bad codependent relationships, but their spiritual advice is I'd stay in it. This
Right.
hang tough. Is like,
Right.
well, that's not really working. So it's like maybe you need to kind of think about, like, just because that's what your moray is and that's what your spiritual guidance is, at some point you have to break out of it. Sometimes the
Yeah.
version of you that believed that and was trying to be a good person because you thought that made you a good person, right?
Mm-hmm.
That
Mm-hmm.
doesn't necessarily mean you're a bad person just because you found out something new. I think there's a lot of
Right.
guilt, and people have to get past it. It's like, just, yeah, don't feel guilty about doing what's good for you because you're an individual, and somebody else might have that belief, and that's fine for them. But for you, that if you need to do something different and it's for your own health and progression as an individual, I think a lot of people feel so guilty about making that choice. And that's another thing to work through. But
Yeah, the another good resource is the Berkeley Center for Psychedelic Studies, and I might have just messed up that title, but if you do an internet search for Berkeley and psychedelics, it's a group that Michael Pollan's also working with. They just put out the survey data. I think they surveyed it was either 1,000 or 1,500 registered voters across the U.S., varied ages, different genders, to get a sense. And
mhm.
it was very, very clear to get a sense of what people thought about psychedelics, especially in the mental health space. And it was very clear that a good percentage, and remember, 1,500, 1,000, 1,500 people, that's like super, super tiny. Um,
Yeah,
and we all know that psychedelics
yeah,
are
it's not the biggest
more
sample
prevalent. It's not the biggest sample, and psychedelics are more prevalent in certain parts of our country than other parts. So you have to kind of keep that in
than
mind.
others. Yeah,
But it was very right. It was very, very clear that half the people were like, psychedelics, no, I would never touch them. And yet, then more than half the people
mhm.
said, hey, we should do some research for the mental health. So there is some, I think my
Yeah,
headphones, are we doing okay?
yeah,
There is definitely
yeah. We're doing all right.
a disconnect a little bit.
Yeah, we're such a fractured kind of system today with the way that our social political system is, that people are so tied to one side or the other, and it's just because, like, oh, I'm on this side, and it's absolute. And the problem is, like in anything, is like the grays are where things happen. Like, people have to learn to compromise, and I think the critical thinking
Mhm.
is really critical. It's like if you just follow and you don't have critical thinking, then you're not really making that judgment for yourself. You're doing it because you think it's a popularity contest, and
Mm,
how much critical thinking goes into that. I
mhm.
kind of think it like high school. Like, did the bully says this, and so all the whole 20 kids in the class follow the bully and then pushed around the nerdy kid. And like, was that the right thing to do? That's a popular thing to do. It's not always the right thing to do. It's like,
No,
are you doing
no.
that because it's logical, or because it feels right, or just because you kind of felt peer pressure into doing it. I feel a lot of people's points of view are kind of like peer pressure, and they're not really critically thinking it through as to like maybe for you, if you ever have this situation, you might want to look at it.
Yeah. Well, it one of the when you read any of the history of why psychedelics became, scheduled substances, a lot of it was a peer pressure or a fear of people experiencing different things versus, hey, there's already evidence that this stuff can actually help people with their mental health. Why don't we keep researching? It was like, no, 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 everything is bad, and doors shut. And it's, in some ways, I'm going to use this word, it was criminal because, I mean, my gosh, if my mother had had access to this therapy, if I had had access to this therapy, even when I was in my 20s, if my mother hadn't had access, I could
Yeah,
have potentially had a different life. I mean, there's millions of people, and I don't think I'm exaggerating because PTSD is pretty widespread. It's
it's
about
pretty
five to
heavy.
six
Yeah,
percent of our population. Millions of people didn't have access to a therapy that in my opinion, they should have. And it was all about what you just said, the peer pressure and the war on drugs. And we just have to name this as bad because we don't necessarily understand it. And I'm greatly simplifying. I don't want to get into a political
yeah, yeah.
discussion about
There,
that.
there's a there's a lot of, being a political science major and a sociology major. We really went into this when I was in college. There's a
Oh,
whole kind of justification in criminology and sociology and even political
oh,
science taking polling. And when I was, that I had double major doing that. And a lot of the analysis it was, there's a lot of people that kind of fear monger and they get
yes,
power from fear mongering. And then the things that could actually help people get pushed down because it's not very logical. Like if you,
right.
there's no science going on with the people making those decisions. Like they're making those decisions because they're going to get votes, or they're going to get power, they're going to have access, they're going to control one industry over another. If you're in
Yep.
one industry that's like the legal industry of alcohol is allowed to destroy a lot
Yep.
of people's lives, has a bad medical outcome.
Right.
And this, if it was controlled and given to therapists and doctors that knew what they were doing, it would not have probably this. They would not have the outcome that alcohol has today, in my opinion,
Right.
at a high level. And so
Right.
people they overblow it. I mean, they're going to make it the monster. You exaggerate the money, create this monster on Maple Street type of situation. you know, you create this
Yeah.
like why do you have to do that? You have to go create like the fear mongering, and I think it's really up to people to go on podcasts, go read journals, go on the net, go read medical papers. There's a lot of power in your phone to just go and
Right.
start looking for yourself, not just what some person said on this talk show or podcast. Like, go check it out. Don't just take it for
Yes.
verbatim. I think that's the problem we have is people just don't take critical thinking. And I keep on saying that, but I think it's really important with something like this because the label could prevent you from doing something that could really help you.
Well, and so one of the challenges when we're researching and we're trying to use our critical thinking skills is, I don't know about you, but I can't read a medical research paper and understand it. I'm not a
Matt,
medical
like,
professional.
yeah, yeah. You probably need something that's a little more approachable.
Well, and that's another reason why we're talking because I mean there are phenomenal research papers about MDMA and psilocybin. I can't even get through the abstract with it making any sort of
Yeah,
sense because that's not my world. And so I went the patient route. I went with what I can explain. And it's purely my experience. It's purely child abuse. It's not somebody who's been through war, which is where a lot of the research has been around PTSD. But my thinking was
probably
is that
veterans.
especially with veterans, my thinking with the YouTube channel was let me try to explain what this is from a patient's point of view so that then people are a little bit more equipped for when like the research paper kind of comes out. Like if I can use analogies, I've got a great
Yeah,
analogy about a wrinkled shirt and trauma and things of that sort to kind of make it easier for people to understand. I think that's my
Oh,
role, so
yeah, that's a
that's like
service.
another reason
Like
why we're
that's a
talking.
service.
Yeah.
Well, that's why I love the idea of this, the internet now. Even with this show, the fact that I can talk to people from different walks of life all over the planet and have
Yeah.
different points of view and different approaches to therapy. I started talking to therapists in the last year and a half. And it was
Okay.
something, and people were like, "Well, why would a musician talk to a therapist?" Like, "Well, why not?" Have you looked at what songwriters write about? It I think we
Right.
kinda need
Right.
we all need therapy. But, so
Right.
the idea that it's like that's not so far-fetched that an artist or a creative person might wanna dive into therapist and dive into ideas about therapy because that's what we do with our songs. We write our songs as therapeutic
Yes.
exercise to kinda take a demon out of ourselves and turn it into something positive. And being creative, we can do that. And that alone doesn't solve it. You probably still need to talk to a therapist, but it feels like it's helping. It's like art therapy. So then you have
Yeah.
the mindset, well, I'm willing to have an open mind and hear what other people have to say. And then what are you the service you're doing with providing your channel is using this medium to make to actually,
Educate.
guide people through it so they have a voice that they can understand that there's not so much science, but it's an approachable patient point of view, like you said, that then makes people say, "Oh, here's somebody that has maybe the same kind of problem I have, and they're trying this, and then they're showing me high level, like elevator pitch level summary that I can understand. And then now I can dive into it and I can start looking at pieces that are a little heavier because now
Yeah.
she's explained it at this level, which I think is how you get into anything, you know?
I think, and some of my videos, I mean, I try not to go more than 6 or 7 minutes because my attention span can't handle that. I mean, I've done overviews, the 40% pre-talk therapy preparation, 20% the psychedelic journey, 40% integration. I've kind of done the overview, and then I'll deep dive into, what are the three most important things to think about when you're integrating, taking time for yourself, what happens when those thoughts come up, what reframing is. I think part of the YouTube channel is even just defining things. I had never heard of the concept of reframing before,
Mhm.
taking the idea that, my father was this hurtful person who was just out to get me, and reframing that to, boy, my dad must have had some massive trauma on his own that he never figured out, and to kind of be empathetic. So even those definitions I dive into a little bit because I was new to the whole thing. So my goal
Yeah.
is to help other people who are like me who are new to it.
Well, that's a very good concept. I think a lot of people, novelists and creative people and artists tend to try to take things and reframe them in a perspective to get the audience to kind of dive into it. It's kind of the nature of
Yeah.
our work is we might not have known that we were reframing, but a lot of what we do now I think about it is you take an idea and a lot of times it's a very painful thing or melancholy or really something deep and you try to put a different aspect on it. You put a different point of view. You look
Yes.
at it like, well, from the frame point of the person, the protagonist or the antagonist, you flip it around. Like sometimes you
Huh?
move the person's is it you or is it the other person? Is it
Other
some
person's
outside
shoes.
person's perspective? And people are looking at it, at different views. You're seeing all these different
Yeah.
views and this kind of perspective. And I think that's how the holistic point of view is like if I can look at like from the protagonist and the antagonist and the audience and some standby of like if I can look at all the different views of the same thing and like how could I frame this idea? And if I'm seeing
Mm-hmm.
it from the crowd or I'm in it or I'm a direct person, I'm an indirect result of it, then you have all these different ways to analyze it. And you were maybe only
Yeah.
looking at it one way. And that's what we try to do to tell the story. And sometimes you have to learn how to tell your own story and reframe it, right? So that you can fully understand it.
So that's exactly for child abuse victims. and my early toddler years were obviously not great. Reframing, I mean, I was an adult thinking, or my body was experiencing life as that fearful toddler. So going back, and it was amazing. It was almost memory by memory, reframing, hey, this wasn't the universe. This was your father who was incapable of being a caretaker. It wasn't the universe. It was your mother not being able to do XYZ. Those memories, almost one by one, and reframing them was the healing. That by the end of
Mhm.
it was like, oh yeah, wait, universe isn't out to get me. I just got stuck with two people who couldn't parent well for their own issues. A lot of empathy
Yeah.
goes that direction too. So it's super helpful. I actually made a comment. It's so funny you talk about like seeing other people's shoes. I made a comment in the book about sometimes looking back at the childhood memories, it almost felt like I was looking at somebody else's memories. That was how
Mhm.
far removed my body's response had gotten.
Yeah, a lot of times
Amazing.
artists, in order to kind of take themselves out of it, they create like a third person that's really them, right?
Yeah.
But they create this other character. I mean, Dylan's very famous for doing that. Bob Dylan would create these characters, and a lot of times they're him, but he go and create this other person that's having this situation, which actually his situation, but he would still
Yes.
create it. And that's
Escape.
it. It's a writing technique to kind of separate yourself so you can go dive into it, and then you can kind of say, "Well, that's not me," but but it is. But you kind of dive into it in different perspectives, but it's still you get to the truth of it. That a lot of times, it's that reframing of that moment and putting it in the
Yes.
eyes of this other person. Is like, do you really need to put yourself back into it? Like if you were putting you in the third person, it's like, well, that's actually me, and then change it around. You gotta flip it inside out. I mean, that's a lot of what we do as artists.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
like take something and then we try to invert it, change it around, mix it up, cut it up, rearrange it, and then say, well, how does that work now? And then actually think about what does it mean that I changed the timeline? What does it mean that I
Mhm.
changed the perspective? And then does it
Perspective.
really, yeah, is it really as
Yes.
high a priority as I thought it was? Is it really as big as an event as I thought it was? Or was it
Was his thing.
that I blew it out of proportion? You know,
Well, and
or it
when we're
doesn't have
little
enough
kids,
proportion. Yeah.
right. My therapist likes to always say, we as adults, we are just little kids wrapped in layers. So me at 5 and my perception of things versus me in my late 40s, now my early 50s, way different perspectives. And, this therapy is what allows me to actually dive into that and change. Because it's one thing to see it. I like what you're talking about as an artist, that you're taking you're using neuroplasticity. You really are, by kind of manipulating and moving things around and seeing things from other perspectives. People with a PTSD diagnosis like me, I needed the enhancement with MDMA to be able to do that. So, I mean, it's the same
Mhm.
premise, underlying thing, just two different modalities to do it. It's a fantastic conversation. Love this.
Yeah, because I'm a strong believer in art therapy, and sometimes, like,
Uh
some
huh.
people don't feel they can get into the arts because they have limiting beliefs that stop them, but I feel like a lot of human beings have creative ability, but they're trying to measure themselves, "Well, I can't be Hendrix, I can't be Jim Morrison, I can't be Janis Joplin, so I can't do it."
But you're
And
you.
and
But you're
that's like a
you.
yeah, it's a mistake because, like, everybody can get and I was really happy, as a kid when I saw the punk movement. I saw bands
Uh
like
huh.
The Clash and the Ramones because then it took the fact that you could come out and you don't have to have the best voice. Or a guy like Lou Reed,
Okay.
the Velvets, like, Lou Reed could just come out there, he's not singing, he's like spoken word, but he's very powerful in what he says, and he doesn't have to, be able to belt it out like Sinatra, but he can still be a great songwriter. And even Dylan doesn't
There's
have
room.
he was the first example of a guy that didn't have perfect pitch, he didn't have the best voice. Most of the record companies didn't know what to do with him, but then they saw what he was writing, and they
Hmm.
said, "Wow, this guy writes amazing." And said, "We guess we'll give him a shot with that voice." And he kept on playing with it and making different versions of it. Some of them were like Arlo Guthrie, Woody Guthrie. Then he came out this nasal kind of hybrid, and it's like, wow, what is
Hmm.
that? And it just caught on. But they allowed it to be, but it wasn't the standard.
Allowed it to
A
be.
lot of people
Yep.
would have just thrown it out. If he had shown up in 1950, he would have never got out. He would have never
Yeah.
got put on record because they're like, no, that's not coming through. That's not right. He's like, you don't have the pitch. And so, that's where, you know, people who break through, they have to have that kind of fearlessness to kind of, be
Hmm.
that kind of cutting edge person. And sometimes you need somebody to help you get that fearlessness. And that's why I think
Right.
where people get into therapy is like they start to push at that fear and get beyond it. And you use the psychedelics or you use therapy and these different concepts to get you past that limiting belief.
Right. Right. And I think it's a matter of where that limiting belief came from. And I think for most of us, a lot of our limiting beliefs came from very early childhood because we just didn't
Mhm.
understand the full spectrum of what we were seeing as little kids. The world revolves around us, even now, even more than now, right? And so we
Yeah,
don't understand that other things can be happening to other people. We just understand that things are happening to us. And so we
yeah,
interpret, I wasn't lovable, I wasn't good enough, I would never be enough. Weirdly, I had I'll never be enough and yet I'm too much. Like that was the weirdest part. You In my instance, I had limiting beliefs that actually fought each other. And they just all came from different memories of trauma. It's really where they came from.
yeah. It's interesting because sometimes you can be that type A with limiting beliefs, and you can get yourself into a really powerful, position where you're like, seems like to the world, like, oh, you must know what you're doing. You're like in this high level position, but sometimes you have that imposter syndrome while you're there. You're like, you don't
Oh yeah.
believe you should be there. And so
Right.
that you could be there,
Absolutely.
and then you have a mask on, and people don't really know that you really don't believe you should be there, but you got there. And so then you're kinda in that position, and it's like there's a push and pull. There's like the duality of it, and then that can be somewhat destructive if you can't solve it.
There are a number of type A people that I know who have actually come forward, like a lot of my friends and acquaintances, people I never would have expected once they kind of heard my story. And it's not uncommon for the people I know, super type A, super traumatic backgrounds. So there's absolutely
Mhm.
a correlation with a need for safety, a need to make sure the environment's always going to be very stable, from people like me with a background that was, the opposite of stable. So it's way more. When I started to open up and talk about it, I was really blown away by how many people came and kind of told me very similar stories. The actual background might have been different, but the level of
Mhm.
trauma was the
Yeah.
same. Yeah.
Whereas a lot of times it's like our parents, you know, didn't have a lot of tools and they were kind of broken. There's a lot of
Yes.
examples in a lot of the families, I know my friends and stuff, highly like very broken families that kind of just toughed it out without
Yes.
therapy. But then they had things going on like alcoholism and domestic violence, and maybe they didn't call it that, but you know, it was that, and they weren't going to jail
Right.
for it, but things were happening. But people thought, oh, that's private. Oh, that's like that
Hmm.
and nobody really got into it, where the child, authorities weren't coming in. But there was stuff going
Yes.
on and people didn't know. And then later it's like all
Absolutely.
building up. And then you suddenly find all these people they wow, in today's world, things would have happened different. You know,
Mhm.
some people might have had consequences that they didn't have back then. But um yeah, it's just
Yes.
a lot of times it's like it's not all roses is come up smelling roses because there's a big image, in the suburbs like, oh, it's just quaint and everything's great. And I grew up in the suburbs, and there's a lot of stuff going on behind the closed doors and things like people don't know.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then you
I don't know
find out
about you,
later
but
when
like
people, get to the point, you're like, oh, well,
I
what's
had
happening?
I had zero idea that I would ever have had trauma from my background. I knew I didn't have a good background, but in my mind there were people who had it so much worse than I did. So I couldn't possibly have trauma or PTSD. And I think it comes from, our generation, we didn't know any different than how we grew up. So, I mean, this generation or the generations that have followed have had a lot more information that I know that wasn't at my disposal when I was younger.
Yeah, my daughter, she's 25 and she has access to all this information that as a kid, I didn't have that. And so I
Yeah,
just,
yeah.
I had whatever the structure was, and so you just gotta tough it out. And and
That's what you
now,
do.
yeah, and then now you have all these forums and all these resources, and you just go on your phone and find it and find
Yeah.
people who are telling stories and you know actually really my daughter's generation is willing to talk about things that you know now like when I'm age 56 I'm talking about it, but I wouldn't have talked about it um
Right.
at all. And like they're already talking about it, and she's been talking about it for, like since she was near her 20s, and I'm like, it's a totally different mindset, to
Totally different. Yeah. Which I think is great. I think it's the first couple steps to healing generational trauma, kind of giving a lot of empathy to what our parents experienced and kind of how they became caregivers. Um, I see a lot of positive on the horizon as more and more people kind of say, hey, wait a minute. Just because this happened to me doesn't mean I have to carry it forward and treat other people that way. I see a lot of positive. So
yeah,
it's my hope.
a lot of people willing to kind of challenge things, and and that scares some people because like the idea that like even with the beginning of this conversation is like, oh, psychedelics, people have the label, and so they're going in, they're going back
Yep.
to the, well, that's a taboo, that's that I can't even go there, and that's where people have to it's a really delicate subject where things are so um so many people are in their own camp, but I still think it's very important to just look up the healing aspects of it, and check out a
Yeah.
channel like yours because then it makes it more digestible. The fact that you go get it to somebody and you're talking about it in a way that makes it understandable. And I think that's a really great service to the audience out there to have that kind of somebody doing that.
Thank you. That's the goal. Thank you. And you're seeing more. I have a Google alert, so I probably see it a lot more than other people, but the media is picking up on certain portions of the media are definitely picking up on the different research that's out there. So I think some people are starting to hear a little bit, but I think the closer we get to FDA approval in 2024, then we're going to see the media really picking up and probably some crazy marketing claims too at some point. So it's another reason for my channel to just kind of
Yeah.
level set. This therapy is work. This therapy is very painful if you're dealing with child abuse. It's what I know, and just to kind of level set and be honest with people to help them make decisions about their own mental health. Because, like you said, people being informed and making their own decisions is really, really paramount for their own happiness. Yeah.
Yeah, so I just encourage anyone who's got an interest in what we've been talking about for the last hour to actually click through on that when we're fully published on all the major platforms. Be able to go to that YouTube channel at the Journey Sage. And I thank you again for being on the show tonight. I think it's very informative. And as I said, people who can click through that even after we're off the air, immediately the YouTube channel that we're on for Phantom Electric will make that's fully clickable on Facebook and Twitch as well. So thank you for being on the show. I think is a great service what you're doing, and hopefully maybe I have guests come back anytime in the future if there's some other aspect you want to talk about. We always have that uh, olive branch out there to let people know. But thank you for being on the
Ah,
show.
this has been a lovely experience and a fantastic chat. Thank you so much, and thank you for letting me have the opportunity to tell people about the educational resource at the YouTube. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you and have a great night.
Too.